Joseph S. Albert W. Quirk, Patrick J. Shepherd, T. W. J. H. Shields, J. J. Radley, W. Shields, Albert L. W. Shotter, Ernest John Shue, W. R. Ray, Walter Benzie, Albert A. Bernhardt, Charles Alfred H. Berry, C. Nelson Hester Betts, George John Matthew George C. Albert Edward by Huon, and W. John Dials. On a chilly autumn morning at 5:20 a.m. on the 11th of November 1918, 9 men met in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne and signed the armistice. The war to end all wars was over. At 11 a.m. that day, the sound of bugles echoed across the battle lines, blowing the call for a ceasefire. The war had claimed over 40 million military and civilian casualties. Over 9 million men were killed in combat, with another 23 million wounded. For many Australians, the aftermath of the Great War did not begin at the 11th hour on the 11th day of November 1918. It had begun much earlier. Captured in the Book of Remembrance are the names of men and women from the Albury region who served in the First World War. For some, their war ended before ever setting foot on a battlefield. Across Australia, men and women from the same family heard the call and enlisted. Their involvement in the Great War and their eventual fate would change forever the fabric of families. During the war, newspapers reported on mass family enlistments. In Brisbane, there were the 6 Keed brothers, and from Perth, Howard, Herbert, Rex, Ralph, Roy and Max from the Wheeler family. From Sydney, the Gallagher boys. The Heathcote brothers from Yerong Creek. From Narrandera, Emily, Leslie and Sydney Birkin, and the Bouquet boys from Howlong. It became a common occurrence. Private John Powie from Wangaratta wrote home about the wonders of the pyramids. He would later witness the death of his 20-year-old brother Charles, killed in action on the Gallipoli Peninsula. 18-year-old twins Frederick and Matthew Mitchell from Wodonga enlisted on the same day and embarked on the same ship. Both were never to return. Leonard Alexander Ryle from Albury enlisted 6 days after war was declared. His brother Owen and their cousin Ronald followed shortly. They did not return. From Albury, brothers Charles, Robert and Harold Huon and their sister Ada all enlisted. Charles did not come back. Portraits of the fallen became shrines and were mourned in family homes and privately within silver and golden lockets. Their names were inscribed on honour boards found in schools and public buildings. Avenues of honour were planted and memorials erected. The women nursed those with visible and invisible wounds. Some had little or no support from authorities. Marriages collapsed and families scattered. Some veterans were denied pensions while others roamed city streets and country roads, haunted and damaged by the memories of war, the scars of war. The aftermath seeped into the future. Over 220 men lost their lives from the Albury region. Many were buried on the battlefield where they fell and interred in mass graves.
Some had a marked grave which provided a little solace to their families. Others were not so fortunate. Over 10,000 Australian soldiers who died in France have no known grave. Their remains lost forever in the brutality of war. 26-year-old John Harold Shields enlisted on the 25th of April 1915. Known as Bud, the staff at the Coal Can office of Dalgety & Co. presented their branch manager with a gold-mounted pipe and tobacco pouch on the eve of his departure and hoped that he would come back soon. On the 5th of August 1916, Sergeant Bud Shields was reported missing in action. Later, he was described in the local paper as a keen and excellent footballer and a good all-round sport. 2 years later, a court of inquiry found that he had been killed in action from a shell blast. Amongst his personal effects sent back to his parents were a mouth organ, a shaving brush, and his pipe. In 1927, 11 years after his death, the Imperial War Graves Commission exhumed Shields' remains and reinterred them in Plot 10, Row M, Grave 3 of the Sierre Road Cemetery, number 2 in northern France. He was identified through his identity disc number 1087 and his cigarette case. As the Belgian and French landscape slowly recovered from the scars of war, the land over time began to surrender fragments of past battles. Skeletal remains and the personal effects belonging to the missing and nameless were gradually unearthed. Albert Archie Rapsy from Wodonga was nearly 24 when he enlisted in August 1915. He would name his father Thomas as his next of kin. Rapsy was killed in action during the Battle of Pozieres on Friday the 18th of August 1916. Over the 2-month Battle of Pozieres, the Australians suffered 23,000 casualties, and of these, 6,800 men were killed. Bert Rapsy's personal effects, just 4 handkerchiefs, were returned to his parents. His epitaph, written by his sister, said, "He sleeps not in his native land, but under foreign skies. Far from those who loved him, in a hero's grave he lies." In 1937, Army Base Records wrote to the father, Thomas Rapsy, regarding the exhumation of an unknown Australian soldier near the village of Pozieres. The only means of identification was a gold ring inscribed with the letters TR to AR. Base Records asked, was this ring given to a son from a father? Could this ring identify the remains of Albert Rapsy? The father never replied to the 1937 letter from Base Records, for he had died in 1922. With a population of fewer than 5 million, 416,809 men enlisted, with 331,781 embarking for overseas duty. 2,139 women joined the Australian Army Nursing Service. By war's end, over 62,000 men had lost their lives, and 159,177 had been wounded, gassed, or had been prisoners of war. Not all men saw active service. Many succumbed to disease, were accidentally killed while training on home soil, or were discharged as medically unfit. Their war was over before it started. 26-year-old horsebreaker Benjamin Combo, an Indigenous man from Dalby in Queensland, was a long way from home when he enlisted in Bendigo on the 15th of December 1915. However, his enlistment was to be short-lived. The commanding officer at Bendigo wrote to Victoria Barracks and asked, "He is very black for a half-caste. Is it correct to enlist him?" Just 3 weeks later, Combo was discharged on the grounds of not being of direct European descent. Undeterred, Combo made his way to Albury and re-enlisted in October 1916. This time, his Indigenous heritage was not an issue. Combo embarked on the troop ship HMAT Benalla, along with 1,590 soldiers and nurses bound for England. But he would never see battle. 20 days into the voyage, Combo died of pneumonia and was buried at sea. It wasn't until 1923, 7 years after his death, that Benjamin Combo's war medals were handed over to his brother Bertie, a resident of the Baramba Aboriginal settlement in Queensland. Over 1,250 Indigenous men enlisted in the First World War. All had to negotiate the racist policies of the period that controlled their lives. On return from active service, they were denied citizenship, excluded from applying for a soldier settlement holding, and barred from joining the Return Soldiers League. The personal effects of deceased soldiers were returned to their families in Australia. Seemingly insignificant objects became a precious link to lives loved and lost. At 4:20 p.m. on the 15th of July 1918, the SS Barunga, bound for Australia, was torpedoed by a German submarine off the Scilly Isles. On board were 5,550 packages of personal effects destined for bereaved family members in Australia. All cargo was lost. Albert Edward Byer, an 18-year-old saddler from Albury, wrote to his aunt in Carrington Street, Albury, in early 1918, saying he was well, the English weather pleasant, and that he would be in France probably before she had read his letter. 4 months later, he was killed. In 1921, his mother Amy wrote to Base Records, inquiring about her son's personal effects. They replied, "Lost at sea, aboard the Barunga." The families of John Leesburg and Arthur Schmidt also received the same news. Those personal effects that were returned were cherished by mothers, fathers, wives and sisters, and would later be bequeathed to the next generation. Over scores of decades, those precious mementos languished in dusty cupboards. Portraits became nameless, and over time, their provenance lost and forgotten. George Christmas Heineke had been married for 3 months when he and his brother Herbert embarked for active duty on the Western Front. Both brothers enlisted on the same day, trained at the same camp, and sailed on the same ship. They died within months of each other in 1917. George Heineke's personal effects were returned to his wife Alice a year after his death. Amongst his possessions were 2 cardboard boomerangs, perhaps taken as a memento of his Australian homeland. The medals of fallen soldiers end up in strange places. Sometimes hard fought over by family members, they were customarily given to the eldest male member of a soldier's family. Over time, these custodians married, moved, divorced or died, and the once treasured heirlooms of the fallen were lost to the winds of time. Known as Jeff, Norman Roseborough was working as a clerk at young husband Rowan Co. when he enlisted in September 1915. He was just 18 years old. On the 23rd of July 1917, Roseborough was killed in action by a shell burst near Ypres. A fellow soldier described him as one of the best liked and most popular men in the battery. Jeff Roseborough's memorial plaque and his Victory Medal was sent to his father's Thurgoona address in 1923. In 1954, they were discovered by workmen in a botany scrap metal yard in Sydney. Returned to military archives, their current whereabouts are unknown. The war did not end at the 11th hour on November the 11th in 1918. Public and private commemorations continue, marking one of the worst bloodbaths in the 20th century. Some say that the impact of war has become part of Australia's DNA. In 1931, veteran William Thomas Kevin wrote to Base Records troubled about money he had borrowed from a soldier mate who was killed during the last stages of the war. He wanted the address of George Gilbert's next of kin in order to repay the debt. Many soldiers like William Kevin were to carry the pain and memories of the war long after the signing of the armistice.